Okay, so today we're going to start on our ritual dimension for Christianity, and we're going to do this over the course of two videos because I have two different slides for this dimension because there's quite a few important Christian rituals. And the first thing to talk about is that up here at the top I have the word ritual as well as the word sacrament. So within the Christian tradition, there is a special word for a certain type of ritual, which is a sacrament. So sacraments are a special category of Christian rituals. So as we go through this dimension, we're going to talk about some actions that are rituals within the Christian tradition and some rituals that are sacraments, which is a very special Christian ritual. And the definition of a sacrament and what kind of differentiates it from just a regular ritual within Christianity is that a sacrament is a ritual in which the presence of God is there. So it is a special type of ritual. So the presence or the grace of God is present when a sacrament is performed. So all sacraments are rituals, but not all rituals are sacraments, if that makes sense. So one more time, a sacrament is a ritual in which the grace of God is present. Okay? And something to note as we go through the different rituals and sacraments is that within the Orthodox and Catholic traditions, there are 7 sacraments. So there are 7 different rituals that count as a sacrament. So that, Catholic and Orthodox Christians believe that the grace of God is present within that ritual. The Protestant denominations, Protestant Christianity, reduces that number of sacraments down to 2. So within the Protestant tradition, there are only 2 sacraments, which are basically baptism and Eucharist or communion, but all of those we'll talk about as we go through them. So important to know what a sacrament is and the difference in numbers. Catholic and Orthodox, there are 7 sacraments, and I'll highlight every one that we go through to note that it's a sacrament. But for Protestants, there's only 2 sacraments, baptism and the Eucharist. Okay, so let's get started here. In terms of daily rituals, Christians are encouraged to pray on a daily basis. Within Christianity, there is not necessarily a set number of prayers or a set form of prayer. Prayer is really more of a personal and casual affair. Casual in the sense that there's not necessarily prescribed words that you have to say for each prayer or prescribed motions. We saw that within Judaism, and we'll see it again within Islam. That for both of those traditions, when you do your daily prayers, there are certain words and actions that you do. For Christianity, that's not the case. There is one formal prayer within Christianity. It's the only formal prayer, which is known as the Lord's Prayer. It's a specific prayer that Jesus teaches his followers. So that's the only prayer within Christianity that really has like a set form to it. So that is done. Can be done on a daily basis or a weekly basis. But in general, Christians are encouraged to pray to God each day, and that can take a personal or unique form. It doesn't have to follow the formal or set prayer. And of course, reading of the Bible is encouraged on a regular basis for most Christians. It's important to note, however, that the emphasis on personal or daily reading of the reading of the Bible is not exactly the same in all the different denominations of Christianity. All Christians in all denominations do focus on the Bible as their sacred text, and Christians are encouraged to read it. But that really comes about because of the Protestant Reformation. Remember that Luther strongly wants the Bible to be translated into vernacular or local languages so that people can read it in their own language. Before that time, the Bible is really only available in Latin in the West and in Greek in the East. And those are not common languages that everyone knows how to read. So today, the emphasis on reading of the Bible is much more central and much more common than it was before the 1500s. Before that time, most Christians had not read the Bible because many people were illiterate, anyways. And even if they could read, the Bible was very expensive because it had to be written by hand, and it was only available in languages that were not commonly known. So most Christians only knew about the Bible from the church setting. They would go to a service and they would listen to a priest talk about the Bible, or they would know about the biblical stories from works of art, from stained glass windows or from icons in the Eastern Church. So learning from a priest, a monk, or a nun, or learning from an artistic representation of a story was really how most Christians knew about their own tradition. So reading of the Bible has been something that has come to be encouraged by all denominations of Christianity, but that really only started about 500 years ago, that started to be really a central part of the lives of everyday Christians. So those two are definitely emphasized on a daily basis for all Christians. Then I have here the weekly rituals. So Christianity does follow in the tradition of Judaism and keeps a holy day of the week. So if you remember from Judaism, Jews celebrate the Sabbath, and they have a tradition of resting on the Sabbath day because that's what God did. In the creation story, God creates the world in 6 days, and then he rests on the seventh day. So because the Christian tradition keeps that same creation story, they do still honor this ritual of having a day of the week that is dedicated to rest and spirituality, but they end up moving it. So the Jewish Sabbath is Friday sunset to Saturday sunset, but the holy day of the week for Christians is Sunday. And Christians move the day of the Sabbath to Sunday because a very important event happened on a Sunday, which is the resurrection of Jesus. So the resurrection happens on a Sunday. And as the Christian church or the Christian tradition is moving away from Judaism, it's separating itself out from Judaism, it was a way to distinguish that community. It was a way to sort of show that we are a different tradition as that started to happen. So the spirit, the idea of the Sabbath is the same, but it moves to a different day. And of course, Christians are not as strict as many Torah observant Jews in terms of what is allowed and not allowed on the Sabbath. And that comes from several of Jesus's teachings, that in several points in the gospel, he actually criticizes the Jewish priests for being too strict about what is allowed and not allowed to do on the Sabbath. So Christianity follows in that tradition in sort of relaxing the rules in terms of rest, but the idea is that the day is still supposed to be dedicated to rest, family, and spirituality. On that day, most Christians will go to a church service. So they will go to a service at their local house of worship. The style of church services varies depending on what type of tradition. There are certain churches known as the High Church, which includes Catholic, Orthodox, and some forms of Protestantism like Episcopalianism, some forms of Methodism, which is that there's a much more sort of formal or ritualistic air to the church service. There's a certain set pattern of, singing and prayers and standing and sitting and things like that. So some of them are much more, you could say, ritualistic or have sort of a focus on the ritual aspect of the church service, whereas some church services are very casual and don't really have a set program, change quite frequently, things like that. So the style of church services varies widely. There's lots of different types and programs and orders to a church service. But for many Christians, the center point of the church service is the celebration of one of the Christian sacraments, which is called the Eucharist or the Communion. So different denominations and in different contexts, it's called different things. But taking Eucharist or taking communion is a very important Christian ritual, and it's one of the sacraments in virtually all forms of Christianity. So what the Eucharist actually is it's a point in the service when Christians drink wine and they eat bread. And when they do that, they believe that the wine and the bread has a very special connection to the blood and the flesh of Jesus. So the origin of this ritual goes back to a biblical story in which Jesus is actually celebrating the Passover with his disciples before he's arrested, and they're celebrating Shabbat. At the beginning of each Shabbat, Jews eat bread and they drink wine. This is a traditional Jewish custom that is still followed to this day. There's a breaking of a certain type of bread, eating of the bread, and drinking of wine together. And when Jesus does this with his followers, who are all Jewish, they're all Jewish men, he mentions that they should think of this as his body and blood, that they are going to be broken and spilled for humanity. So Christians repeat this ritual. They eat a piece of bread. What type of bread, varies depending on the denomination, and they drink a little bit of wine. And that is supposed to have, again, as I said, a very special connection to the body and the blood of Jesus. That connection is understood differently depending on the denomination. For Catholic and Orthodox Christians, there is a certain ritual leading up to the eating of this bread and the drinking of this wine that changes the substance of those items. The doctrine is called transubstantiation, and what happens is they believe in a mysterious way, that human beings cannot fully understand because it's a divine mystery. The bread actually becomes the flesh of Jesus, and the wine actually becomes the blood of Jesus. So when individuals ingest the bread and the wine, they are sort of reenacting or taking part in the crucifixion. So the crucifixion becomes a living moment again, something that didn't just happen at one point in the past, but that happens over and over again, is present in that moment that the individual Christian is eating the bread and drinking the wine. For Catholic and Orthodox Christians, this is important because it affects the forgiveness of sins. So an individual who is taking Eucharist or communion has to spiritually prepare for that ritual. They have to confess their sins, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It's the sacrament of reconciliation, so that they are coming to the bread and the wine in a pure state. They have asked God for his forgiveness, and that forgiveness is granted through the ingesting of the bread and the wine. Right? Because remember, according to Christian doctrine, Jesus' death affects the forgiveness of all sins. So it's actually the repetition of this ritual that lets a human being participate in that crucifixion again and again, and to have their sins forgiven again and again as they go throughout life. So the Eucharist or the communion means something very special for Orthodox and Catholic Christians. And because of that, it's really the center of their weekly church service. And actually, for Orthodox and Catholic Christians, you can take Eucharist every day if you wanted to. It's not just something that happens once a week. It's something that's offered on a very regular basis. So it's much more important to Catholic and Orthodox Christians than it is to Protestant Christians, because it means something very special. It actually becomes the body and blood of Christ, and it affects the forgiveness of sin, the continuation of the forgiveness of sins. As human beings continue to sin in their lives, because they always will because of original sin, they have to continue asking God for his forgiveness, and that forgiveness is granted through the ritual of the Eucharist. So that forgiveness is freely given, throughout an individual's life, but they have to participate in that ritual to continue receiving that forgiveness. So that's what the ritual is, and that's what it means for Catholic and Orthodox Christians. Protestant Christians, it means something very different. Martin Luther disagreed with the doctrine of transubstantiation. He believed that the bread and the wine don't actually become the flesh and the blood. Nothing changes about the substance of those two items. So for Protestant Christians, it doesn't literally become the flesh and the blood of Christ. It is a symbol of those things. So the bread is still bread and the wine is still wine. It is just a symbol or a memory of, the body or the flesh of Christ that was sacrificed and the blood of Christ that was spilled for humanity. So for Protestants, it doesn't become something else, and therefore it also doesn't affect the forgiveness of sins. So taking communion for Protestants is done in memory of the sacrifice of Jesus. It's a reminder of the crucifixion and the death of God. But there is nothing sort of spiritual that is happening in that ritual. It is done simply as a way to remember and to focus on that sacrifice of God. So because it's not as important because it has nothing to do with the forgiveness of sins for Protestants, it doesn't happen as often. Whereas, a Catholic and Orthodox service, it's really the centerpiece of the service, and you wouldn't have a service without the celebration of the Eucharist. Protestants really only celebrate the Eucharist maybe once a month, and there's some denominations that do it even less frequently than that. So it's not done on as regular, as frequent of a basis. But that's a ritual it is a sacrament for all the denominations of Christianity. Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant all consider the Eucharist to be one of the sacraments. The next ritual that I have down here is reconciliation. Reconciliation is a sacrament for Catholics and Orthodox Christians, not for Protestants. Reconciliation is a sacrament that you might know if you didn't grow up Catholic or Orthodox. You might know it by its more casual or vernacular name, which is confession. So reconciliation is the sacrament in which individual Catholic or Orthodox Christians either go to a priest and verbally confess their sins to the priest, or they can confess their sins privately to God. In both of those traditions, there's sort of a hierarchy in terms of sins, and something that is more serious, you would be encouraged to go actually talk to a priest about those things, confess your sins to a priest. Also, if you wanted to, there are many people who simply want to have that spiritual guidance. They want to be able to talk to someone about what they're struggling with in their lives, and to sort of receive that feedback and suggestions on how to, how to overcome that temptation. But it is something that is not necessarily required that every Catholic and Orthodox Christian do, but it is encouraged and it is seen as necessary for certain types of sins. So anyways, during this ritual, an individual will, as I said, will go to a priest, and they will verbally confess their sins. They will say out loud the sins that they have committed, that they want to have forgiven. So what happens and why it's important is that God offers his forgiveness every time a sin is confessed, right? That an individual feels sincere repentance for that sin. But the forgiveness is offered through the medium of the priest. So the priest actually offers the individual forgiveness on behalf of God. And usually there is some sort of prayer or action that an individual has to take in order to receive that forgiveness. Oftentimes a priest will recommend saying certain prayers, right? So, because you've done this, you need to ask God for his forgiveness directly, and you do that through prayer. It can also be some sort of restitution for what has been done, right? If you were very cruel to someone, if you treated someone cruelly, then part of that action that a priest could suggest is, well, if you really do feel repentant, you need to go apologize to that person, right? That's a way of showing that you feel sorry for that sin. And then basically the forgiveness is offered on behalf of God. The individual who has confessed It has to perform those prayers or those actions that were suggested by the priest. Then the forgiveness is completed through the ritual of the Eucharist or communion. So Catholic and Orthodox Christians also need to go to confession. They need to confess their sins before they are spiritually prepared to take the Eucharist or communion. They need to take that ritual in a purified state so that they have sort of prepared themselves for God's forgiveness. This is something that Martin Luther also does not agree with. So this is not a part of Protestant Christianity. In Protestant Christianity, individuals pray directly to God to ask Him for His forgiveness. There's no intermediary necessary. There's no verbal confession of sins or no sort of actions or prayers that have to be taken to have that forgiveness be enacted. Protestant Christians are encouraged simply to pray directly to God, ask God for God's forgiveness, and the understanding is that God will simply give His forgiveness to that individual if they are truly repentant or sorry for what they did. So those are some of the weekly very important rituals and sacraments for Christianity. Then the last thing I have here are just the two most important holidays for Christianity, which is Christmas and Easter. Christmas celebrates the birth of Jesus. It happens on December 25th each year. For Catholic and Protestant Christians, it actually happens a few weeks later in the Orthodox Church. So the Orthodox Christmas is actually usually in early January, not on December 25th. They have different dating systems for their holidays. So Orthodox Christmas and Orthodox Easter are on different dates than both Catholic and Protestant celebrate them. So Christmas, as I said, celebrates the birth of Jesus. The date, at least for Western Christianity, the December 25th date, that was fixed not based on anything biblical. So there's actually nothing in the Bible that talks about when it was that Jesus was born. The reason that Christmas gets set on the date of December 25th has to do with another holiday that was celebrated on December 25th in Western Christianity. So the date of Christmas is actually based on a pagan holiday. There was a holiday that was celebrated by Western Europeans that was called Saturnalia, and it's connected to the winter solstice. The winter solstice is right around this time. So as Christianity spread from the Middle East and the Mediterranean into Western Christianity, it was really sort of a tactic of the medieval church or the early church to try to convert what they called the pagans, right? People who didn't practice Christianity, practiced one of the pre-existing religions in Western Europe. So it's really hard to tell people you have to stop celebrating your holidays. Holidays are traditions. It's something that people look forward to. So it's really hard to tell people you have to stop celebrating your holiday. So what the church did was they would allow individuals to continue celebrating their holiday, but they would add a Christian meaning to that holiday. So the day of Saturnalia was changed into Christmas. Or the festivity of Saturnalia was changed into the holiday of Christmas. So instead of celebrating a Roman god and the winter solstice at that time, the same rituals would be done. They would just be done in honor of the birth of Jesus. So actually a lot of the traditions that Western Europeans and North Americans have for their Christmas celebrations are original to the pagan holiday of Saturnalia and not to anything biblical. Traditions such as the Christmas tree, the Yule log, there's some other European traditions. Those were actually all a part of Saturnalia. So those are a part of the pagan holiday that was celebrated before Christmas. So it does become an important Christian holiday because it does celebrate the birth of Jesus and the stories that are present in the Bible about the events leading up to the birth of Jesus and the birth story itself. But yeah, a lot of people don't know that it's actually the holiday itself is actually based on a pagan holiday. It was sort of laid on top of a pagan holiday, which interestingly enough, a lot of Protestant denominations, including the Puritans who came to the colonies, who came to America, they didn't celebrate Christmas. So a lot of really strict Protestant denominations have oftentimes outlawed the celebration of Christmas because it has these pagan roots to it. So Christmas is celebrated today. It's celebrated with families getting together. Traditional foods are eaten and gifts are given. So it's a gift exchange holiday. That was also a part of the pre-Christian tradition that was celebrated, but it does also have a biblical origin. Because in the story of Jesus, there are 3 individuals who come to visit him, and they bring gifts to Jesus and to the family. So the gift giving part is from the biblical story. But really, the most important holiday in the Christian calendar is Easter. Easter is theologically much more important, and it celebrates not the birth of Jesus, but the resurrection of Jesus. So Easter is the day on which Jesus came back to life, was resurrected from the dead. And the date of Easter is set on a much more historical basis than Christmas is, basically because the day of the resurrection was the Sunday after Passover, because Jesus was celebrating Passover with his disciples, with his followers, before he is arrested, crucified, and then rose from the dead. So the dating of Easter doesn't fall on the same day each year. It changes. And how the date of Easter is chosen is a little bit different now. But originally it was always the first Sunday after Passover, because that is when the resurrection happened, was the first Sunday after Passover. So Easter is celebrated usually more with spiritual reflection, church services, and then a celebration with family and friends and food, because it is celebrating the resurrection. It's celebrating for Christians the victory over death that Jesus enacted with his resurrection, or signaled with his resurrection. There are certain events leading up to Easter. Easter is really the center of the Christian calendar, and the idea is that the holiday is so holy that Christians need to prepare themselves to properly celebrate and honor Easter. So there's a period of time leading up to Easter called Lent. Lent is the 40-day period, so whenever the date of Easter is set, and I said it changes each year, so the 40 days leading up to Easter for that particular year are known as Lent. And that number 40 is very symbolic. There's the Jews wander in the desert for 40 years. Jesus is tempted in the wilderness for 40 days. He stays on earth for 40 days after his resurrection. So that number is repeated multiple times throughout the Christian Bible. So for 40 days leading up to Easter, Christians are supposed to give up certain things in their life. They are supposed to perform certain sacrifices. Traditionally, that has meant giving up certain foods and certain activities, so that time can really be sort of focused on spirituality, focused on experiencing sacrifice, so that Christians can better understand the sacrifice that Jesus made through his death. And that sort of gets Christians in the right mindset to properly honor and celebrate Easter. So that's the 40-day period. And then also in the week leading up to Easter, it's called Holy Week. And there are certain days and events and rituals that are done throughout that week that honor certain or commemorate certain events in Jesus' life leading up to the crucifixion and the resurrection. So during that week, Jesus does certain things. So on those days throughout the week, those events, those stories are told, and certain rituals are done to sort of commemorate those actions that Jesus did during that time leading up to his crucifixion and resurrection. Okay, so that's all we have for the first dimension of rituals and sacraments. And then we have one more slide where we're going to talk about some of the life cycle rituals in Christianity. Okay,